محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. الحمد لله، نحمد الله سبحانه وتعالى ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا، من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. First of all, I want to welcome Leyla Shahin, Dr. Leyla Shahin, who's a member of the Turkish Parliament, and the group of people that came with her. I don't know all the names, but she there she is right there. Stand up maybe, just stand up so they can see you. Yeah, thank you. Alaikum assalam. So she has been at the forefront of women's rights in Turkey, including religious rights, and helping restore the right to wear the hijab for women in Turkey. So she's been a very important person for human rights in Turkey, because certainly religious freedom is a human right according to Islam, la ikraha fid-din, and also to the Western system based on the United Nations 1947, I think it was, or 48, when they ratified the Charter of Human Rights. Religious freedom was at the forefront of those rights. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I'm going to finish what we started, inshallah, on the principles derived from Sidi al-Mawaq. And Sidi al-Mawaq is a very important scholar for a number of reasons. One, he was the last scholar of Al-Andalus, quite literally. He was in the delegation that met with Ferdinand and Isabella when they surrendered Granada to the Christians. And that surrender was not by any means an unconditional surrender. They had 80 stipulations in the actual treaty. Because the Muslims were still quite strong, they were able to withstand almost a 2-year siege on the city. It was a walled city, and they had the mountains behind them, so they were able to bring in supplies. And they were hoping that the Muslims from Morocco or Algeria would come to their aid. There's a wonderful scene for anybody who's read Don Quixote. Has anybody in here read that book? Do you remember the lion scene from Algeria? Yeah. There's a famous scene in that book of the lions that come from Algeria, and everybody's afraid of them. And Don Quixote says, "No, open the cage. I'll fight them." And when he opens the cage, they all just kind of yawn and they don't do anything. But that was really an allusion to the fact that the North Africans didn't do anything to help the Andalusians other than take them as refugees, which is a big help, but they certainly didn't go. Because if you read that book, Don Quixote, which is the first novel in human history, Cervantes spent 7 years in Algeria. He knew Arabic, and a lot of hadiths are actually mentioned in that book as proverbs about the age of chivalry, and the great knight that he's trying to imitate is Amadeus, right? And he claims to have written it, that he found the book, and it was written by Ben Ghazal, an Arab, Hamid Ben Ghazal. Right? So it's a very interesting book, about that period of, and it's only recently, because I read it a couple of times, and I read it in Spain, and it was very clear to me that there were a lot of Islamic motifs, but recently there actually has been research in Western academia about the Islamic influences on Cervantes. So anyway, back to back to Sidi al-Mawaq. So Sidi al-Mawaq was in that last period. He's considered an authoritative Maliki scholar in both furu' and usul, because fiqh is divided into furu', which is the branches, and those are that would be akin in Western law to what we call statute law. And then usul, which would be akin to constitutional law. So constitutional law gives you the frame by which laws are made. But the statute law are the actual laws that are made from within that frame or matrix of constitutional theory. So usul al-fiqh is the theory behind the legislation. And then fiqh is the actual rulings. And one of the problems with Islamic fiqh, or one of the things that is problematic with Islamic fiqh, is that it's very difficult to implement it as statute law. In fact, the Ottomans attempted with Abd al-Majid II, when they did the Tanzimat, they attempted to codify Islamic law because the commercial law in particular was necessary in dealing with the Europeans who had codified legal systems. So they attempted to do it, but the Islamic law is more organic, and it's very difficult to have a hukm that is universally applied in every situation, because the judge will look at every situation as a particular case. It's like the difference between naturopathic medicine and allopathic medicine. In naturopathic medicine, every case of asthma is unique. So Sidi al-Mawaq was both usuli and a faqih. He has a famous commentary, Tajul Iklil, on the Mukhtasar of Khalil, which is the preeminent later abridgment of Maliki law. He was also a student of Minturi, who was a student of Ibn Lub, and this is in the Maqasidi tradition, because the Malikis in particular, but also Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's and Imam al-Juwayni's school is a Maqasidi school that attempts to look at the underlying reasons for the Sharia, getting at the purpose behind the Sharia. And so the maqasid are the aims and ends of Sharia, like what the Sharia is trying to do. And then you have the means to those ends, which is why ahkam can shift based on the maqsad, the purpose behind it. And that makes it very difficult, because it needs very creative legal minds to work within that framework. In the West, you have things like the Supreme Court, where these are where the creative minds are supposed to work to figure out things. But in the Islamic tradition, the judge should really almost be at that level. And traditionally, they really were, in best case scenarios, the judges were of a very high caliber because the training took so many years. In the West, legal training literally takes 3 years, which from a Muslim perspective is insane. To give a person a license after 3 years to practice law would be considered madness in the Islamic tradition. In the Islamic tradition, you would have at least 15 to 20 years before you would get a permission to issue fatwas and to be fair, in the Western tradition, it takes a while to get to the stage where you can actually be like the Supreme Court, where they do issue those type of judgments. Because they're more like muftis, with the exception, they're like a mufti and a judge, because their positions become binding. Although the great legal theorist from Princeton University, Robert George, has a brilliant, I think, argument about the original intent behind the Supreme Court, and how it differs from the modern. This is for the Americans, even though everybody else gets affected by this stuff, unfortunately. So he says, حُكْمًا مَكْرُوهُ عَدَمُ نَقْضِهِ بَعْدَ وُقُوعِهِ. We talked about that yesterday. The ruling of a makruh is that you don't rescind the ruling once it's happened. Somebody asked me after the class for an example. An example of that would be marriage contracts, certain marriage contracts could be makruh, and so it would be, you would tell them not to do it. But once it's happened, it's not haram, and what's happened is marriage. And so you're not going to rescind the marriage because of something that was makruh and not haram that was done. النهي عن الشيء أمر بضده. To command something means to also command to prohibit something means to command the opposite of it generally. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تقل لهما أف, don't say to your parents أف, then the opposite means speak kindly to them, right? So if a nahi comes, it very often means to do the opposite, right? ولا تنهرهما, so don't insult them or be mean to them. قلة الإثم بنسبة إلى كثرته خير كثير. Very important qaida. Less sin in relation to more sin is a great good. And this is very important. This is why traditionally Islamic societies tolerated levels of sin. And you get into Western, if you read Max Weber and the theories about crime and the social functionality of crime, this is also related to this. Not to the same degree, but in that you have to allow for flexibility within a society. Because if you try to eliminate all sinfulness, it will lead to greater sinfulness. So there are certain things that you want to focus on. Like in our culture, we're seeing a collapse of family. So focusing on things that will keep the family healthy and survive is more important than focusing on other things of lesser importance. And this is a type of triaging, to use a term from emergency medicine. If somebody comes in with a headache, it could be a brain tumor and it could actually be extremely dangerous. But you're not going to treat that person before you treat the person who's lost a limb and they're bleeding to death. You have to look at what's more important. So then he says, القرب إذا شهد الشرع باعتبار جنسها فهي مندوبة. In actions that draw you near to Allah, if the Sharia recognizes the genus of the action, this is very important because in logic you have a genus and you have what's called jins and nu' and khasa. These are terms from logic. They're called the 5 predicables in classical logic. So you have the genus, and then you have the kind, and then you have the difference, the differentia. The genus and the difference gives you the kind, the species. So for instance, if you look at a human being, our genus is animal. Biologically, obviously we have eternal souls, which is a theological, but looking at us as a species among the species of animals, we are under the category of the genus of animal. We're not vegetable, right? We're not mineral, we're animal. But what gives us our difference? Intellect, because other animals don't have it. So that's the difference. You put the difference in the genus together and you get the species, which is rational animal or human being. Qurba there's a genus, like dhikr is a genus. There are many types of dhikr that differentiate that dhikr from other dhikr. So recitation of Quran, the genus is dhikr. But the species, right, is the reading of Quran. Right? So it's dhikr by reading the Quran. So what he's saying is the genus of dhikr is encouraged in Islam. There are many ways to do that. And so, if the Sharia sees that this is from the genus, then there are many ways to do that. And there's a big khilaf amongst people that say all of ibadah is tawqifiyah. That's true. But dhikr is what is mawquf. Dhikr is what is from the Prophet. اذكروا الله ذكرا كثيرا. Do much mention of God. اذكروا الله الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم. They remember Allah standing, sitting, and reclining. So the Quran gives these 3 hayat, which are the hayat, the things that human beings do, that all those are appropriate to do dhikr in. So now there's bid'ah in dhikr. undeniably. But generally, the dhikr is seen as a good thing. النوافل ما قدر الشرع أن في فعله ثوابا من غير أن أمر به أو رغب فيه أو فعله. So the nawafil are those things that the Sharia says there's a reward in. So dhikr is a type of nafila, and there's a reward in doing dhikr. Whether it encourages a specific kind of dhikr. Like for instance, you could just be saying, Ya Muhayminu, Ya Muhayminu, Ya Muhayminu. Sidi Ahmed Zarruq says if you want to strengthen your memory in his commentary on the 99 names, Ya Muhayminu is a good name to do constantly. There's nothing in the Sharia that says the Prophet used to do Ya Muhayminu. But the Quran says call on the names of Allah. And Al-Muhaymin is one of the names. So it's permitted. Now there's certain names that people aren't encouraged to do a lot. Like you don't want to call Ya Mumit. You know, that's not a name that you really want to invoke unless you've got some enemy in front of you. Ya Mumit, Amit, you know. But generally, it's not a name that you want, Ya Mumit, you know. And I mean, you don't really want to call on that name as a type of invocation because it's one of the Jalali names. And anyway. ما اختلف العلماء في تحليله وتحريمه فلا يقال فيه حرام. If the ulama differ about its tahleel and about its tahreem, you don't say haram as a am statement. The early ulama did not say haram. If you look at the early period, Malik and Abu Hanifa, they used to say things like, La yu'jibuni, I don't like it. Or La yaf'aluhu an-nas. When Malik was asked about music, he could have said haram. He didn't. He said, La yaf'aluhu illa al-fusaq indana. It's something that the people that aren't very religious do it in our community, right? But he didn't say haram because it's amr mukhtaraf fihi. Now, when the majority of ulama say something is prohibited and a minority say that it's not, then generally the ulama tend to go with the dominant opinion because of the hadith of إِذَا اخْتَلَفْتُمْ فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِالسَّوَادِ الْأَعْظَمِ. When you differ, be with the majority. وَيَدُ اللَّهِ مَعَ الْجَمَعَةِ. The providential care of God is with the jama'ah. So ما اختلف العلماء في تحليله وتحريمه فهو مكروه ومن تركه أجر ومن فعله لا يأثم. So when the ulama differ about some say it's halal, some say it's haram, it takes the hukm of makruh. You get a reward if you don't do it, but you're not sinful by doing it. Very important qaida. إذا ظهر للمرء خلاف ما يظهر لغيره فيمتنع في ذاته ولا يحمل الناس على مذهبه. If it appears to a man something that is another comes to a different conclusion, he can not do it in and of himself. If he thinks something's haram, but other people say it's not, but he thinks it is, then he shouldn't do it himself. But he shouldn't force other people to follow his school. They said about Imam al-Ma'zari that his knowledge was so vast that he never actually would attack anybody. Because he would say, maybe he's following the opinion of so-and-so. That's how vast his knowledge was, that he found excuses for people in what they did. مذهب المحققين أن كل مجتهد مصيب. The madhab of the masters is that every mujtahid is correct in his ijtihad. الرد على قول ابن حزم أجمع على أن متبع الرخص فاسق. That there's a rejection of Ibn Hazm's claim that those who follow license are fusaq, irreligious people. انعقد الإجماع على أن من أسلم فله أن يقلد من يشاء من العلماء بغير حجر أو حجر. So the ijma' is that whoever becomes Muslim, they can follow anyone amongst the ulama. They don't have to follow any specific group or opinion. لا تسع الفتية والحكم إلا بمشهور المذهب. You should follow the dominant opinion. العارفون بلا أفضل من العلماء بأحكام الله. The Gnostics, those who have knowledge of God are over those who have knowledge of the categories of God, the ahkam. So this is the purpose of life is to know God. فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Know that there's no God but Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, شَهِدَ اللَّهُ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Right? وَالْمَلَائِكَةُ وَأُولِي الْعِلْمِ قَائِمًا بِالْقِسْطِ. So the angels are witnessing that there's no God but God. And then أُولِي الْعِلْمِ, those who are firmly rooted in knowledge. So this is the purpose. And that's why Ma'ruf al-Karhi, the great Zahid from Baghdad, who was a contemporaneous with Ahmed bin Hanbal, they asked Ahmed bin Hanbal, because he had ulama in his gathering and great students of knowledge, they asked him once about Ma'ruf al-Karhi. They said, هل له نصيب من العلم? Does he have any knowledge? And he said, عنده رأس العلم خشية الله. He has the whole purpose of knowledge, which is awful awareness in the real sense of awful, an awe-inspiring awareness of God. So in other words, he has the purpose of knowledge. إنما يخشى الله من عباده العلماء. Those who have khashya are the ulama. So that's the real alim, even if he's not very knowledgeable in the sharia. If he has real awe of God, then he's a arif. He's a alim billah. Even if he's not a alim bi ahkamillah. Because you can have a person who knows all the rules of sharia, but he's fasiq. He's an irreligious person. And there are many in the history who knew all the knowledge, but they didn't practice it. مخالفة الجماعة فيما أبيح لنا ليس من شيم الأئمة. Going against the group in those things that are permitted for us is not from the habits of the imams, of the leaders. In other words, you shouldn't go against the urf of a people in the mubahat. So if they stand up, as long as the person doesn't want them to stand up, if the urf of a people is to stand up, or clapping, things like that, this is a'raf. If you start going against these things, you create fitna in a community. And this is part of this book is written to end fitna. Right? And too many Muslims, really, they want to just enforce their views, believing very often that they're rightly guided in these things, thinking that this is what's expected. We have to condemn these things. And they'll bring hadith to prove it. They'll bring verses of Quran to prove it. But this is not the way of the ulama of our tradition. The ulama were very gentle in their amr bil ma'ruf and nahi anil munkar. They weren't harsh with people. And then they also prioritized the triaging. What's more important? That people gather to hear a good lecture, or that they don't clap. And if you start rebuking them for clapping, maybe they won't come back again, because it's like, what's that about? What's up with that? Is it really that big of a deal? But people make these things very big deals. And these are things that go under a'raf. They're customs and norms, right? The norms of a people. المعصية لا تنقلب أبدا مكرومة بسبب النية. And then so فعل الخير لا يمنع من أراده إلا أن يصح. إن السنة نهت عنه من وجه لا معارض له. To do any act of good should not be prohibited for the one who wants to do it, unless there's absolutely something sound from the sunnah that prohibits it in a way that there's nothing that contradicts that. It's a really important qa'idah. If people want to do good, and then they say, oh, that's a bid'ah. If it's a good, and there's nothing in this gets to a masala that's very important in our tradition, which is called tark. And this is why the next thing that he follows that up with is, الترك ليس بموجب لحكم في ذلك المتروك إلا جواز الترك
وانتفاء الحرج فيه خاصة. وأما تحريم أو لصوق كراهية فلا، لا سيما فيما له أصل جملي متقرر من الشرع. This is a really important قاعدة. If you understand this, you get a lot. If the Prophet did not do something, this is called tark, right? وَسَكَتَ عَنْ أَشْيَاء, right? رَحْمَةً بِكُمْ لَا نِسْيَانَ. God was silent about things as a mercy to you, not out of forgetfulness. فَلَا تَبْحَثُوا عَنْهَا. You know, لا تسروا عن أشياء تبدأ لكم تسؤكم. Don't ask about things that once it comes to you, then you're distraught by it. The Prophet did not like a lot of questioning. Don't delve too deeply into things. هَلَكَ الْمُتَنَطِّعُونَ. They perish, the extremists. So you can go into this kind of extremism. The early ulama differed about tark. Imam Malik inclined towards avoiding things the Prophet did not do. That's because he had a lot of wara'. It's not to say the other imams didn't have wara', but Imam Malik was very conservative. For that reason, for instance, he considered it makruh to recite Quran in one voice, because he couldn't find anything that said that the Sahaba did that. The other Imams said, like Imam Shafi'i, tark is not a dalil. If the Prophet didn't do it, it's not a proof that it's haram. And if you can find something of the genus that permits it, then it's perfectly fine to do. So, in the example of the Quran, the hadith in Sahih Muslim, ما اجتمع قوم في بيت من بيوت الله يتلون كتاب الله ويتدارسونه بينهم إلا نزلت عليهم السكينة وغشيتهم الرحمة وحفت بهم الملائكة وذكرهم الله في من عنده. So in that hadith, أو كما قال, in that hadith, no group of people gather in a house of the houses of Allah يتلون كتاب الله. Right? It doesn't say يتلو أحدهم الكتاب ويسمع الآخرون. One reads it and the other. No. اجتمع in the Arabic language, افتعل, اجتمع means to gather together. So they gather together and recite the Quran together. So they said, this is a proof. Right? And the fact the Sahaba didn't do it is not a proof that it's not prohibited to do. Now, some of them use the hadith, the athar from Ibn Mas'ud that says that Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu found some people in Iraq that were in a circle of dhikr, doing dhikr together, and he said, what is this? And he said, Nadhkur Allah. He said, Afuqtum ashaba Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Are you better than the companions? In other words, we didn't do this, why are you doing this? That's often used as a dalil. Well, Sidi Ahmad Zarruq in the Qawaid says, and this is a qaida in what's called adab al-bahth wa munadara, the comportment of discussing and debating about issues, ala naqil as-sihhatu wa ala al-muda'i ad-dalil. That if you're going to mention some naql, if you're going to transmit a hadith or a verse or anything and say, qala or qala fulan, so-and-so said, you have to show that it's sahih. The attribution is sound. If you're going to make a claim, you have to bring a dalil, either naqli or aqli. There's two types of dalil. Dalil naqli, which is a transmitted dalil, or a dalil aqli, a rational dalil where you can prove it by reasoning that this is true. So Ahmad Zarruq says, bring the dalil of that, because we're not going to leave a sahih hadith in Sahih Muslim that says that you can gather, or the hilq al-dhikr, that because Ibn Rabah said, hilq al-dhikr, hilq al-halali wal-haram. That's true. The circles of dhikr are the circles of fiqh and learn. Like this would be considered, even though we're not in a circle, it would be considered to be dhikr, because we're learning the ahkam of our deen, we're learning our religion. So this is the reward of doing dhikr of Allah, which is higher than sitting and saying Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, which is good. وَفِي كُلٍّ خَيْرٍ. There's good in that. But the way of knowledge is a higher way of the two. So that's really important about tark. And Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayya wrote a really important book, Al-Mashahid min al-Maqasid, about this very issue, proving that tark, if it's understood properly, will resolve most of the conflict, the religious conflict in our community where people say that's haram. Because if it's a masala, if it's related to tark, then you can't use it as a proof against people. To say the Prophet didn't eat something doesn't mean that it's prohibited to eat. Now, it's true, Sahaba, when the Prophet, they brought him lizard, the Arabs used to eat lizard. In fact, the Persians made fun of them, calling them akratul dab, the lizard eaters. The Arabs used to eat lizard. Well, when you're starving, lizard will taste pretty good. It's like one of the Zuhad who used to eat really, really bad bread, and one of his friends came and he said, "How do you eat that stuff?" He said, "By not eating it for several days." It'll taste pretty good, right? So, I'll give you an example. And this is how we get spoiled. When I was in the Sahara, no bread. Now, in the West, most people do not eat bread on their own. They have to put butter on it, put something else on it, right? But if you haven't had bread for a really long time, bread on its own tastes really good. And that's the idea behind it. So, how did I get off on that? I know that. Yeah, thank you. Somebody's paying attention. Yeah. That the Prophet ﷺ, if he didn't eat something, it wasn't. So the Prophet ﷺ, when they said it was lab, he withdrew his hand. One of them said, "Aharamun ya Rasulullah, is it prohibited?" He said, "No, except that my people don't eat it." In other words, and there's a tradition, Omar, يعني أعطوا كل جسد ما اعتاد, give bodies what they're accustomed to from food. One of the signs of the real sickness of the modern period is eating a lot of different types of food. So people have, what do you want to have tonight? Indian, Italian, Chinese, Turkish. They're all the different. Traditionally, people ate the same food every day, and then on their festivals, they had different foods. So the body doesn't know what to do, because one day you give it all this Chinese food, and it's like, I'm from Ireland. Why are you giving me Chinese food? Next day you give it Italian, and what's up with this? So it gets confused, and that's why traditional societies always ate the same thing every day, the same thing. So the body's used to it; it knows how to deal with it. But when you give it all these different things, it creates a type of physiological confusion, and then it begins to break down and get sick. Anyway, that's my theory. But so the Prophet ﷺ did not eat lizard. That doesn't mean that it's haram, because there's no proof that it's haram. So if you go to China, where they eat dog, now I wouldn't eat a dog, but Maliki said it was makruh. In fact, Imam Shafi'i has a proof against. He said, "Idha nafs ta'affuhu." If the self considers it foul, then it's prohibited to eat. So he would say, like snails, escargot. The French eat snails. He would say, because most people, you talk about eating slugs or snails, they just feel sick. Now they're trying to convince people to eat insects. Have you seen this latest movement to eat crickets and things, good protein, and but people generally don't like that. But some people like things. Now cats, it's too far, because cats, Chinese culture, some Chinese eat cats, which I think that's fitra gone wild. Yeah, because cats, you should not eat a cat, trust me. you know. And I don't think you should eat a dog either, but the Malikis did permit it because Imam Malik would not prohibit something he could not find a clear dalil for. So he said it's makruh. Even khinzir al-bahar, which is what we call the porpoise. You know, porpoise is from a Greek word which means pig. So it was called the pig of the ocean because it has a snout. And it's related to the dolphin. They're from the same family. The dolphin is called dukhas or dolphin. They asked Malik about eating porpoise, right? Khinzir al-bahar. And he said, Antum sammaytumuhu khinzira. You know, you named it pig, so I wouldn't eat it, you know, just because Allah haram al-khinzir, you know, so even if it's khinzir al-bahar, don't eat it, right? And I would not eat a porpoise. They're like our cousins, you know, they're probably down there discussing what's real and what is not, you know, right? They have huge brains, right? Porpoise and dolphins. But everything from the ocean is permitted, right? Yeah. كما ترك السلف الأول الحديث المروي غير معمول به Hello? Hello? Was somebody recording? Why do I have a phone here? This is not my phone. Hello? Assalamu alaikum. Naam. Hello? Türkçe bilmiyorum. Huh? Is this your phone? Do you speak English? Arabic? Yeah. Whose phone is this? Oh. Oh, it's not? Okay. Well, that's a case for minding your own business, right? So, just as the Salaf would leave a hadith, غير معمول به. This is really important. Malik left many hadith that were absolutely sahih because he didn't find anybody practicing them. And he didn't feel comfortable taking a hadith that nobody practiced because these are the tabi'een. He had 600 teachers from the tabi'een. They studied with the Sahaba. And he said that if it was a practice, it surely would have been implemented. And one of the proofs of the people of Medina about this was if the imam if the muezzin fell from the minaret, everybody would have been talking about it. So if the Prophet ﷺ emphasized something, it would have been widely known. So he would leave hadiths that were solitary that he couldn't find action on. I'll give you one example of that. It is absolutely sahih that the Prophet said not to fast on Friday. He found all the people in Medina fasting on Friday as a virtuous day to fast. And so he said, I'm not going to take a solitary hadith that is only probabilistic when the people of this city who were with the Sahaba are fasting on Friday as a virtuous day to fast. And so he said, and this is why the hadith is not, everybody says, إِذَا صَحَ الْحَدِيث فَهُوَ مَذْهَبِي. If it's a sound hadith, this is what I follow. That's not a categorical statement. That statement has to be constrained by other considerations. Because if every sahih hadith was taken, you would have a lot of confusion. Because some hadiths contradict other hadiths, and either they try to find out if it's abrogated or abrogating, and that's the case, like in camel doing wudu from cooked food, which was initially something that the Prophet did, but then after that he said that it was fine. Or, for instance, not having children for the first 4 years, after a child, and then he permitted it. So these are type things that you'll find in the hadith that the Muslims, the ulama squared away, but not all of them were squared. And so for that reason, there's a difference. So he's saying, and this is why Ibn Wahb, one of the greatest scholars of hadith tradition, he's from the Rijal of the people of Sahih. Ibn Wahb said, أكثرت من الحديث حتى تحيرت. I learned so many hadith, I became confused. وَلَوْلَا مَالِكٌ وَلَيْث لَهَلَكْتُ. And had it not been for Malik and Layth, these two great fuqaha, I would have perished in my confusion. He said, I went to Malik and I would tell him a hadith, he'd said, دَعَهُ, leave it. It's غير معمول به. It's not a hadith that's acted upon. Imam Malik knew over 100,000 hadith. In the Muwatta, there are less than 800 hadiths. Out of all those hadiths that he learned, there's only, because the hadith literature is for the ulama. Unless it relates to Fadail al-Amal in books like Riyad al-Salihin, Arba'in an-Nawawiyya, those type books, they can be learned, and there's a great blessing in hadith. But if you go in untrained into the hadith literature, you'll be on a new deen every day. Because you're going to find something, and then later you'll find something that contradicts it, and this is the reality of hadith. So the hadith literature traditionally was for the ulama. It wasn't for urd al-nas, the majority of people. It was for the ulama. And he says, فَكَذَلِكَ نَحْنُ بِالرِّوَايَةِ. And we are the same with the riwayah, the fuqaha. نَعْمَلُ بِعَمْرِ الشِّيُوخِ. We follow the teachers. وَنَتْرُكَ الرِّوَايَةِ. So if our shaykh says something, then we follow that. This is for at the level of before you're a mujtahid. If you're a mujtahid, then you don't have to. But if somebody is less than the rutbah, the rank of ijtihad, then they follow what the ulama said about these things. Or else, and this is why the hadith is the hadith literature is vast, because the early period, they collected everything and they wanted to ensure that nothing was lost. But then they left it to the fuqaha to sort it out. And so the muhaddithun are called sayadila. They're the pharmacists, and the fuqaha were called the doctors. You don't want the pharmacist prescribing the medicine, because he doesn't know how to prescribe. What he knows is whether the medicine is useful or not. So the muhaddith is a saydali. This is the metaphor that our ulama used. He's a saydali. He says this is sahih, but the faqih looks at it and says this is for prescription, right? Or not. Very important distinction. So he said, أو نذكرها على أن نسلمها ونحن في ساعة من مخالفتها. Or we can mention it and recognize that we can actually disagree, not disagree, but act opposite of what the riwayah is saying. This is high knowledge. أو نفصح بالتأويل عوضا من التصريح بالنص الصريح. Or we can express in nufsihu بالتأويل, we can express an interpretation or articulate an interpretation in exchange for whatever the tasrih of the nas is. So we make a ta'wil. So ta'wil is to go from the literal to another type of meaning when the literal is something that it's not working out. And there are many examples of that in the tradition. ما لم ينهى الله عنه ولا نبيه فلا معنى لمن كرهه. If Allah didn't prohibit it or the Prophet didn't prohibit it, there's no meaning in saying it's makruh. Because nahi karahiyya comes from Allah and His Messenger. إن الخلاف إذا لم يكن في أمر شرعيا إنما هو يعني شيئا جائزا. A difference of opinion, if it's not from a sharia matter, إنما هو يعني شيئا جائزا. Then it's just permitted. If it's not about Sharia, if they differ about a reason other than the Sharia, it's just a difference of opinion. It's a permitted thing. So if إنما هو يعني شيئا جائزا هل ينفع أو لا فينبغي أن يعمل. Is it beneficial or not? Then if that's the khilaf, people can do it. الأشياء أصلها الإباحة. This is the dominant opinion. There's another opinion, أصلها التحريم. That's a valid opinion, but the vast majority of ulama said أصل الأشياء الإباحة. The foundational legal ruling of all things is permissibility until you have a proof that it's prohibited. That Allah, He's the one that created everything in the earth for you. So everything is permitted unless there is a clear nas that it's not. And that's the dominant ulama. وقاية العرض بترك سنة واجب في الدين. Protecting your dignity, even if it means leaving a sunnah, is an obligation in the religion. ظاهر الأحاديث أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يرشح للصحابة ما يأتون في مستنبطاتهم من عمل الخير. It's clearly indicated in the hadith tradition that what the Prophet ﷺ, what the Sahaba were doing from good deeds based on their own istinbat, that he encouraged it. So when he would see them doing something good, he would encourage it. ليس كل ما فعلته العجم منهيا عن ملابسته إلا إذا نهت الشريعة عنه ودلت القواعد على تركه. Not everything the non-Arabs do is prohibited from doing, as long as the Sharia didn't prohibit it, or the qawaid, the principles that we have don't indicate that it should be avoided. This is really important because there are hadiths that say don't follow the ajam, don't do what the non-Arabs do. Those hadiths are sometimes specific to the Arabs. So for instance, the Prophet ﷺ said, من يحسن أن يتكلم بالعربية فلا يتكلم بغيرها فإنه يورث النفاق. Whoever is capable of speaking properly in Arabic, he shouldn't speak in other than Arabic because it will cause hypocrisy in his heart. كان مالك يكره رطانة الأعاجم في المسجد. Imam Malik didn't like the non-Arab speaking in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. If you take those hadiths, so what? Our religion means everybody has to become Arab? The Quran says that in the difference of your complexions and your tongues is a sign of God. The Prophet ﷺ spoke Farsi to Abu Huraira when Abu Huraira had stomach ache, and the Prophet ﷺ said to him in Farsi, "Is your stomach aching?" He said, "Yes." The Prophet spoke Habashiyya when Habib came back, gave him a shirt from Ethiopia. He said, "Inna hasana," and he used an Ethiopian word to say it's nice, because she had learned Ethiopian while she was in Ethiopia. He spoke with every tribe according to their dialect. So when the Yemenis came, he spoke Yemeni dialect. And there's an indication that he knew all the languages. So the Prophet ﷺ did not prohibit language. The Quran, even though it's all Arabic, Araba, it turned into Arabic some other terms from other languages. So Firdaus is originally from Persian, right? Paradise, it's from Persian. The Qistas, right, was a Latin term. But the Quran, Arab, ala khilaf. I mean, there's a khilaf about this issue. Imam Suyuti wrote a whole book on this subject. So it's a khilaf issue, because inna anzalnahu Quranan Arabiyan, we sent it down as an Arab Quran. There's a khilaf, but generally, it's and then there's a debate about whether Arabic is the mother tongue or Syrianiyya. Min ajaib ma tara al-aynani anna su'al al-qabri bis-Syriani. Imam Suyuti said that in the afterlife, everybody speaks Syriani. And there's a hadith, it's weak, but it's there, that حب العرب لي ثلاث لأنني عربي والقرآن عربي ولسان أهل الجنة عربي. I'm Arab, the Quran's Arab, and the tongue of the people of paradise is Arabic. But anyway, if you take those hadiths and say, oh, people can't speak Arabic, or I speak Arabic there, I have to speak to you in Imam Shafi'i's first madhab, because he has different madhab stages of his development, he prohibited buying and selling in other than Arabic. في المذهب القديم. Now the reason for that was, he said, if you're going to buy and sell, it has to be in some language. So why should the Arabi yatanazal? Why should he go down and go down? Why not make the other one learn Arabic? But then he changed his opinion, because if you're Arab and you speak Persian and you want to sell to a Persian and he doesn't speak Arabic, you're not going to have a sale. So you might as well speak Persian, right? So there's nothing wrong with speaking other languages. It's good to learn Arabic. It's the language of our religion. One of the things about the Ottomans is they never imposed Turkish on other civilizations. So when the Ottomans, when they were ruling Egypt, the administrative language was Arabic. When they were ruling Iraq, the administrative language was Arabic, because they didn't have this colonial mentality of imposing. Whereas when the English, no offense to our English brothers and sisters, when the English went to other places, in fact, it's said that the monkeys in India they know language, but they refuse to speak out of fear the English would put them to work. But when the English or the French went, they made everything in French and English. So Moroccan administration became French. Algeria became French. In fact, many Algerians lost their Arabic because of the imposition of French. The English, when they conquered, I'm sorry to, point out the English, but they're one of the great colonizers in human history. When the English colonized Ireland, and they say the Welsh or the Irish that couldn't swim, right? When the English conquered Ireland, they cut out the tongues if they spoke Gaelic. So Irish people whose original language was Gaelic don't speak Gaelic anymore except in few areas. They're trying to revive it like they've revived Welsh in Wales as a language. But they lost their tongue, literally, for speaking Gaelic. This happened in Andalusia. They used to cut out the tongues of Quran teachers so they wouldn't teach the Quran. And now we have our community abandoning the Quran when people lost their lives for teaching the Quran. It's amazing. So languages are honored in Islam. Every language, every people's language is their language. And that's why in many cultures, a lot of Arabic names went to those cultures, but they didn't adopt only Arabic names. Just like in the West, most Christian people had names from the Bible. So if you meet Western people, it's David and John and Yohanna, Dawood, Jesus, if you're Hispanic, Jesus. But not all the names. Many of the names are like Laurel, right? From ivy, because they were pagans before they were Christians. And so the spirit world was all embodied in the animal and vegetable kingdom. You had native peoples, Aboriginal peoples named after animals very often. So Native American Indians had names that related to animals. The Bedouin Arabs had names related to animals, Fahad and Nimr and Dhi'ib and Jahash and names like that, right? That's tradition. So the Prophet, when he came, he didn't change everybody's names and make them all get new names, right? They have their names that they had in Jahiliyyah, unless the meaning was against a name. Then he would change it. So if they were like Abdul Lat, he would change it. Or Abdul Atiq, he would change it. But he didn't change names. Hanbala, he didn't change. Talha is the acacia tree because it's hard and it gives shade. And they used tree names because the Arabs really love trees. So people can use names. They don't have to have an Arabic name. And so you go to like Gule in Turkish, right? You have a name like that. It's a Turkish name, nothing wrong with that. So somebody says, why do you have that name? I mean, my son's named Daniel, right? We were in Mecca, and he was in the restaurant, and some lady said to him, what's your name? And he said, Daniel. And she said, A'udhu billah, that's not a Muslim name. In Mecca, it's like, and he was like in tears. He comes up to me, and I said, what's wrong? He said, she asked my name. I said, Daniel. And then she said it wasn't a Muslim name. And I just went up to her and I said, taqillah. I mean, that's an taqulu ala Allah bighayri ilm. It's a dangerous thing to speak without knowledge. Just shut up. If you don't know something, la taqfu ma laysa laka bi ilm. Don't go in areas you have no knowledge of. The better response is, I've never heard that name, I didn't know Muslims use that name or something. But to say it's not a Muslim name, because Daniel is in the Qasas al-Anbiya of Ibn Kathir. He has a chapter called Bab Daniel. It's in the Hadith. The Indian and Malay Muslims use it as a name for their children, right? It's the reason Arabs don't use it is because it's a very common name amongst Arab Christians, and they don't want to confuse traditionally their children with the Christian children, right? So that's fine. That's urf, if you want to distinguish yourself. Because the Christians have certain names that they use. Most Arabs can identify Christians by their names, whether they're Coptic or Lebanese, or because they use certain names the Muslims don't use, and vice versa. So that's an example just of you can use any name that's good if it's from your culture. If you want to call your child, a good name, that's fine. Or if you want to use the names like John, if you're a convert to Islam, or you're raised in the West and you want to use John instead of Yahya, the Turks say Mehmet. They don't say Muhammad. They say Mehmet. There's nothing wrong with that, and that's why Joshua becomes Joshua. For instance, in the Quran, you have Ibrahim, which is qira'ah sab'iyya, and then you have Ibrahim, which is a qira'ah sab'iyya. It's a valid recitation. So if you called your son Ibrahim, it's as valid as Ibrahim because it's a sound qira'ah. Or if you want to call him Abraham, there's nothing wrong with that. These are issues that, were resolved centuries ago, and they just shouldn't be issues anymore. But this is when ignorance becomes widespread in a community, all these problems arise. And then humility of just not having that basic thing to say, I didn't know that. I mean, people say that, like, really? I didn't know that. Well, gee, do you know everything? I mean, is it really surprising that you should say, I didn't know that? There's lots of things you don't know. I remember years ago, I was in the Emirates, and they brought these tiny little finger bananas that I'd never seen before from India. And I was like, subhanallah, I've never seen a banana like that. And the sheikh said to me, there are many things you've never seen in this world. Right? That was a good lesson for me. There are many things that you've never seen in this world. And there's even more things that in the next world that we haven't seen. مَا لَا عَيْنٌ رَأَتْ وَلَا أُذُنٌ سَمِعَتْ وَلَا خَطَرَ عَلَى قَلْبِ بَشَرٍ. No eye has seen or ear has heard or even occurred to the heart of a human being. That's the akhirah. Ibn Abbas said, لَيْسَ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا الْأَسْمَاء. The only thing the dunya and akhirah share is the names. The realities are completely different. So it's, when the Quran says there's grapes in paradise, don't think they're like these grapes down here, right? Where you have to spit out the seeds. So that's important. And then dress also. There are hadiths about man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. Whoever imitates the people is from them. And so one of my teachers, Abdullah At-Tiridi, who was a student of Sheikh al-Ghumari, and I actually have ijazah from him from Morocco. Sheikh al-Ghumari was very rigid and strict about things, and he wrote books. Sheikh Abdullah has a book, Al-Istinfar fi Ghazat al-Tashabbuh bil-Kuffar, like calling people to fight the ghazwa of not imitating the kuffar. And that's his book. And it's all these hadiths. It's a litany of hadith about not imitating non-Arabs, about don't dress like the Ajam, and don't... Sidi al-Mawaq said all of the hadith that relate to not imitating the Ajam are specific to the Arab. They have no relationship to Ajam that become Muslim. So this idea of not dressing like, and then you see converts who suddenly put on a robe and a ghutra, thinking that this is Islam. There's no dress of Islam. There is no dress in this religion that is specific to the religion. The Prophet ﷺ wore a Habashi shirt. He wore a Roman shirt. It was a Romani, qamis Romani. Kana dayiq. It had narrow sleeves. He wore a Yemeni red striped jubba that one of the Sahaba said, I never saw anything more beautiful than the Prophet in that red striped jubba, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he was international in his dress. He didn't wear anything specific to indicate. Now he did wear a turban. And he did cover his head. But he also went hasir al-ras to show that it wasn't haram not to cover your head. The Andalusians, the urf of the Andalusians was not to wear anything on their head. So the Andalusians did not, in Mauritania, the Mauritanian urf for the men is not to wear anything. They have the turban wrapped around their neck, and then when they go out in the sun, they put it on. Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, all the time, he just, right when he gets inside, he pulls off his turban and he puts it down. Right? So the turban, undeniably, is it's arguable that it's from the Sunnah. There's a khilaf about it, but it's arguable. But, let me give you an example. The Maliki said, it's only Sunnah if you do it with tahniq. So you have to do the turban wrapped under the chin, because that's the way the Prophet ﷺ wore his turban, with a du'aba, wearing like the way Jama'at Tabligh puts down and has two, they have two coming out. The Prophet did that. But he wore it under his neck. And this is why the Muhannak was the alim who had the tahniq. He reached a level and he started wearing the turban with the tahniq. So Uthman Danfodio says, if it doesn't have the tahniq, it's not sunnah. So if you put a turban on your head, it's a turban, but it's not the sunnah turban. That's his opinion. Other scholars didn't go by that. So these are khilaf issues. So if the urf is not to wear the hat, which is the common urf in most places now, not to cover the head for males. But it's actually not good for you because the sun goes through the hair, and if you're in areas where there's a lot of sun, it's actually very bad to be exposed to sun. You can get cancer. That's why if you go to a dermatologist, they'll check your hair, under your hair, because it's a very common place to get skin cancer. And we know now that exposure to the sun is except for very small amounts to get your vitamin D, like 10 minutes a day maximum. But other than that, it's not a good thing to be exposed to the sun. And people that have a lot of sun exposure, they wrinkle quicker, they have a lot of skin problems, especially if they're from northern climates. So traditionally, people covered their head, in both male and female. Now, female coverage is the urf of the Bani Adam. I mean, women have covered their head in every civilization, except for Aboriginal peoples who usually wore very limited. They didn't have textiles, so they didn't make cloth. Most of them wore skins and things like that. Aboriginal peoples and the elite, who have always not done those things. But the Byzantine women covered completely, like a lot of some of the areas in the Gulf, the modern Gulf Arabs, where they cover even with the niqab. That was a Byzantine tradition. And Marshall Hodgson argues that it actually was adopted by the Muslims from the Byzantines because it was the elite women that covered their faces, not the common women. And historically, in the Muslim world, it was the elite women, which is why on Hajj they're not allowed to cover their face, because it was something that distinguished the wealthy from the poor. So the women on Hajj weren't supposed to cover their face. And that's a khilaf issue. I don't want to get into that because some madhabs say that the face is awra. The majority is not. But there are some of the ulama that said the face of a woman is awra, she should cover her face. It's a weak opinion traditionally. And then they say that fasad al-zaman, a relative hukum about fasad al-zaman, because there's an argument that every zaman outside of the prophetic period was a corrupt period. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. يختص النهي بما يفعله الأعاجم على خلاف مقتضى شرعنا أما ما فعلوه على وفق الندب أو الإيجاب أو الإباحة في شرعنا فلا نترك ذلك لأجل تعاطيهم إياه. So if non-Muslims, I mean he's really talking about non-Muslims here, if non-Muslims do something, the prohibition of imitating them is in only those things that go against our Sharia. As for what they do that is either encouraged or an obligation or permitted in our Sharia, we don't leave it because they do it. Right? We don't leave it because they do it. ينبغي للمتورع أن يتورع في خاصة نفسه ولا يحل له ولا يجوز أن يحمل عليه أهله وعياله. The one who is scrupulous in his practice should only be scrupulous in what pertains to himself. It is not permissible for him to force his family or his children to follow that same. This is great wisdom because this is what drives kids out of Islam. When you try to force them, you take the strictest opinions and you try to force it on your children, it makes them rebel. This is great wisdom. العامي لو زنى أو سرق كان خيرا له من أن يتكلم في العلم ولا يعلم ولا سيما فيما يتعلق بالله وأسمائه وكلامه. A common person, and a common person is somebody who's not from the ulama. Everybody, yeah, and then, I mean, you have degrees. Like most of us are tulab al-ilm. You know, we're students of knowledge. And all of you, inshallah, are students of knowledge. The alim is like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya is a alim. You know, to say that, you know, and some of us, like Dr. Omar is, I mean, I would argue that he's a alim in ilm al-kalam. Like he knows ilm al-kalam very well. And he's mutafaqih. He knows fiqh. He studied fiqh to a good level. He knows usul and things like that. But even he himself would not put himself in the category of somebody like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya. And I certainly would never do that. So we have students of knowledge that are from ammat al-ulama. You know, they're like the amma of the scholars. All right? So they're not from the amma per se, but they're also not really from the khasa. All right? And then you have, I mean, that's my category, so don't take that as a, you know, rule. I'm just, you know, that's not a real category, but it's just helping you understand these differences of what a du'at, the fuqaha, the mutafaqi, the alim, the mujtahid, the allama. These are all terms that are important to distinguish and are not distinguished anymore. So anybody that memorizes Quran now and can give a good talk, people think he's alim, which is a real problem because ilm takes years to master, and especially it has to be done at the hands of masters. And autodidacts can be very dangerous for this religion. So that's very important. He's saying that for a common person to fornicate or steal is better for him than to speak about knowledge without knowledge. This is not a gratuitous statement. It's not an incorrect statement. It's based on the verse in the Quran, قُلْ إِنَّمَا حَرَّمَ رَبِّيَ الْفَوَاحِشَ. Say, إِنَّمَا, only, my Lord has only prohibited al-fawahisha, ما ظهر منها وما بطن. Inward and outward fawahish. Fahisha in Arabic is كل ما يقبح ذكره عند العرب يسمى فاحشة. Everything that the Arabs don't like to say explicitly, they call it a fahisha. So if they don't want to mention the sin, they just say fahisha. هذه fahisha. It could be theft, it could be fornication, it could be adultery, it could be stealing, but generally it's applied to sexual sins, generally. So لا تقربوا الزنا, like don't go near zina, fornication. إنه كان فاحشة. Allah calls it a fahisha. ما ظهر, what's manifest from it, those things that are done with the limbs and you can see it. وما بطن, those things hidden in the heart, like hiqad and bughd and hasad and ujub, arrogance, kibr, those type of things are والإثم, and then general sinfulness, والبغي بغير الحق, and then oppressing, unjustly oppressing people, baghi, right? وأن تشركوا بالله ما لم ينزل به سلطانا. So this is the maratib of sin. This is maratib al-dhanb. These are the degrees of sin. The first and least harmful are the natural sins. Theft generally is done because somebody's in need and then they can become accustomed to it. But generally, theft is when people are in need. So it's understandable why people steal. Fornication is an appetite of the animal nature. It's understandable why people can do that. But oppression, now you're getting into something that is really oppressing another person is something that's really, and then shirk, associating with Allah, taking the right of Allah who created you and acting in rebellion against His right. But the last one, وَأَن تَقُولُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in says, these are the degrees, and the highest and worst sin, which is more sinful than shirk, the unforgivable sin, is to speak about God and you don't know what you're talking about. And that's why all of our ulama, when they ended their statements, they said, Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Allah knows better. That's His way of getting out of saying something about God. In other words, I'm doing my best, but I'm not going to put myself in a danger. I saw a quote-unquote fatwa from somebody about the moon sighting, and it was saying calculations, and this is the haqq, and everybody should follow this. And at the end, it didn't say, Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. You know, which is an indication the person doesn't know anything about knowledge. Because that's just a basic standard of, you know, or just say, you know, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. You just say that. Because it's ijtihad. But to say this is the haqq, that's أن تقولوا على الله ما لا تعلمون. You're saying what you don't have any authority to say. You have no authority. And this is in His asma, in His sifat, in His ahkam, in all those things that relate to God, in the deen itself. This is why our ulama didn't like to say haram. They would say, لا يعجبني, I don't like it. You shouldn't do it. دعه, leave it. But to say, هذا haram, that's why the later ulama tended to use it because there was so much. In the early period, the wara' was strong, so if the alim said, don't do it, people didn't do it. But over time, they stopped responding. And so they started saying it's haram. They got more assertive because they were, you know, and they genuinely believed it was haram. But I think that early period needs to be restored because haram doesn't mean anything anymore. And so everybody's now in danger of perdition. I mean, they had a fatwa from a leading Muslim institution that seeing the film Nuh is haram. You know, Noah. It's not Nuh, it's Noah. Seeing the film Noah with the Australian actor, right? Russell Crowe, yeah, thank you. So somebody from down under there, obviously. So, you know, they said, oh, it's haram to see Noah. First of all, pick your films, man. We've got a ummah now that are watching pornography. I mean, pornography is a major problem in our ummah today. And just look at the Google stats, if you can trust Google, but look at the Google stats on pornography downloads and searches. The highest ones are in the Muslim countries. And it's a real crisis in our community. So, I mean, maybe they'll go to Noah and have Tawbah, afterwards. I wouldn't see it. I don't want to see it. But I'm just saying, like, pick your films, Either say they're all haram, but this is a problem because, people, now it doesn't mean anything. Your 18-year-old kid in the Muslim world, they're not going to listen to that fatwa. It just becomes abath. It becomes meaningless. So they hear haram, it doesn't mean anything. I heard Shaykhna bin Bayya, the brilliant son of Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayya, Shaykhna said, he heard one of the du'at on TV telling the parents, giving them advice, don't say aib to your children about things. Tell them haram and halal. Don't say aib. We have to get rid of this whole cultural thing, and this is deen of Allah. And that is really not understanding the importance of urf and social regulation. Because people will not do things out of shame from society. Right? Inna Allah yaza'u bis-sultan ma la yaza'u bil-Qur'an. God will prohibit things with the government that He doesn't prohibit it with the Quran. In other words, just out of fear of being punished by the government, people will not do something that's haram, whereas because the Quran says don't do it, they'll do it. The human nature. So the social regulation is very important to say this is aib. Aib. It's better than saying in many instances it's haram. Because if they do it, at least they know it's a aib and they'll hide it. But if you say it's haram and then they do it, it had an intihak. It's degrading the hurma of God, the sanctity of the deen. So unless it's absolutely haram, we should avoid that word. Because we need to retrench. We need to see what we're up against. We have a tsunami of sinfulness out there, and we need to choose our battles. Right? So we have to get back to the kaba'ir, because people are doing kaba'ir now. And the saghair will be forgiven, إِذَا اجْتُنِبَتِ الْكَبَائِرِ. The hadith says that Allah will forgive lesser sins if the major sins are being avoided. And so focusing on major sins and just not putting all that attention, everything's haram, so people get fed up. I can't do this. It's too hard. Islam. Like Azhar Usman said, it's not Islam, it's hard. Right? الفضائل والترغيبات تنقل على غير الوجه الذي تنقل عليه الأحكام. So virtuous deeds and encouraged things are transmitted in other ways than the ahkam are transmitted. The hukm shar'i has to be a dalil sahih. You have to have a sound dalil or qiyas that's valid, analogical reasoning that's valid. Or if once you get into usul, masalih al-mursala, istihsan for those who call. I mean, there's a whole slew of things that usuli scholars have to learn in order to derive rulings. But the point is that for virtuous things, the ulama were not rigorous about asserting proofs for virtuous things, because virtue is a good thing. So if it's a good thing, it's better people are doing dhikr than doing something haram. So if they're doing dhikr in a way that might not have been transmitted, but it's still from the genus of dhikr, it's better they're doing that than they're doing something haram. Now there are some people who take the other school that said, no, it's better that they're doing ma'asiyah and not doing a bid'ah. I mean, unfortunately, there are some people that, it's a very small minority, but they really believe that. It's better they're in the discotheque than in the zawiyah. Because at least in the discotheque, they know it's haram and they can make tawbah. In the zawiyah, they think they're doing something good and they won't make tawbah from it. This is the type of reasoning. But when you take this madhab and this methodology of our usuli giants, because he's in the tradition of Ibn Ulubbin, of Imam al-Shatibi, of Imam al-Qarafi, of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. These are the great giants of usul. This is their minhaj, which is a much healthier minhaj for a society that has a lot of diversity and a way of keeping people in Islam and in the halal. And this is why then he says, لما في ذلك من الاستناس في الترغيب على الطاعة والإعانة في النفس لكي يحصل لها شيء من أخرها, because this will help them to do obedient things and in order that they might get their akhirah. Instead of making everything haram and chasing them out of the religion, it's better that you try to find makharij for them, of ways of keeping them in the haram, either by taking weaker opinions or taking sound interpretations, things like that. This is what our ulama did to keep people in the halal. They didn't want them in the haram. So they would do everything they could to get them out of the haram. One of the things he says in this book is about, if you have somebody addicted to alcohol, teach them the oud. Because the alcohol is mujma' ala tahrimihi. He said the oud is mukhtarif fihi. And he said that music has a type of intoxication that's similar to alcohol. So you can get them out of the haram into a difference of opinion and help them. But if you try to take him from his alcohol to be like in the masjid praying in the first rank, he said it's too wide. You go shwaya shwaya. Just take them little by yawash yawash. Take them little by little, right? Just slowly get. This is hikmah, this is wisdom. The Prophet ﷺ was very gentle with people. He took them slowly. He didn't take them all at once. I mean, they were drinking alcohol. Look how long it took for alcohol to be prohibited. Because had he brought all the ahkam at once, they wouldn't have become Muslim. It's too much. So he had to strengthen their iman. So if somebody comes into Islam, don't force them into all these things. I mean, I had a case, I'll give you a personal example. There was a lady who became Muslim with me, and the first thing she asked about was makeup, because she had been told that it was haram. And I just said to her, no, don't worry about makeup. It's not important. It's fine. Wear your makeup, right? People who heard me, some of the, a'udhu billah, he permits makeup, and she ended up leaving Islam. I asked about her, and I was, where's that lady? And they said, she left Islam. I said, why? And they said, because they told her that she was now in fornication because her husband wasn't a Muslim. And she just left Islam. It's just amazing. These people have no fear of God. No fear of God. I had another case of a woman who called me, and she had become Muslim. She's a very highly educated woman. Her husband was highly educated. She called me because somebody gave her my number, because she was being told she had to leave her husband because they were no longer validly married because he wasn't a Muslim. She loved her husband. She had kids with him. And so she called me, and I told her, no, you don't have to leave your husband as long as he's not opposing your Islam. You can stay with her. 6 months later, he became Muslim. Now I wouldn't have known that had it not been for Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya. And it's a weak opinion, but in this age, those are the opinions that you need to keep people in the fold. And it's an opinion on Ali ibn Abi Talib, which has the chain is sound. So, but it's better to say I don't know, or And then he finally, a few more things. Madhab al-Sufiya. Now, when they say the Sufiya, don't think of what we call Sufis today. Like people know, like if you're from Pakistan, you go to Baba Farid, or from India, you go to these places where you'll see people tying little ribbons to tombs and things like that, and people say they're Sufis. The Sufis were the original Sufis were ulama. They were not ignorant people. They were ulama. Imam al-Junayd was a mujtahid in the madhab of Thawri. Shibli was a qadi in the Maliki madhab. He had a very high rutbah in Maliki madhab. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali is one of the greatest Shafi'i jurists in history. I mean, these were great ulama. They were usuli, they were mufassirun, So this idea now of the ignorance that's widespread in our community, and you have these ignorant people that call themselves Sufis. That's fine, whatever. But that's not what he's talking about. When he says madhab al-Sufiyya, he's talking about the ulama. And they were generally the strictest. The Sufiyya were very strict about ahkam, but they were easy on other people. That was the difference. In themselves, they were extremely strict, but with other people, they were very generous and would find makhraj. So now it's the opposite. You'll find that they're very easy on themselves, but they're also easy on other people generally. And I'm not going to, bash people that go under the name Sufiya if they want to call themselves that or something. I mean, I had a lady who, she was like just on the fringe of Islam, and and she told me, I'm a Sufi. That's fine, alhamdulillah, I'm happy for you. Well, I'm saying, no, you're not. A'udhu billah. Your Sufis are, where's your hijab? Sufis would always wear hijab. This is the other extreme. So you have these two extremes in the community of people that just speak ill of the Sufiya. Ahl Sufiya, Maulana al-Rumi was a great scholar before he was a poet. He was a great scholar. He was well versed in the ulum al-shar'iyya. He transmitted hadith, muhaddith. He's in the chains of the muhaddithun of his time. So Sadruddin al-Qunawi, who's here, was a great scholar. He was a Quranic master. People came from all over the Muslim world to read hadith with him. He was a master of hadith. So this whole idea that these people weren't the ulama is wrong. They were ulama. Now there are some amongst them that were illiterate that Allah gave big openings to. That's true. And that's a possibility. But generally, the vast majority were great scholars. So he says, مذهب الصوفية أن ما هو من باب الأعمال إذا كان لا يناقض حكما شرعيا بل ذلك في باب القرب المندوبة وشهد الشرع باعتبار جنسه فإنهم يأخذون به ولا يلتفتون لصحة أصله. So the madhab of the Sufis, if they find actions that are not contradicted by a Sharia ruling, and they're from the qurab and mandubat, they're from things that get you closer to Allah, and the shara' recognizes the genus, they take those things, and they're not concerned about whether the asl is sahih or not. That's a madhab. You don't have to follow that madhab, but it's a valid madhab. It's a valid madhab, because these are ulama. They're not talking about ignorant people. They're talking about scholars. That was their opinion. ما أدى من الوسائل إلى طاعة فهو طاعة. What ما أدى من الوسائل. So those things that are means to an act of obedience are an act of obedience. So for instance, in order to recite the Quran, you have to learn the Arabic script. That's a means to an act of obedience. So the actual learning of the Arabic script is an act of ta'ah, of ibadah. So the means to an action has the hukm of the action itself. If you're doing it to get to an act of obedience and you can't get there without it, then it itself is an act of obedience. Now this last one is very important. I want you to reflect on it. جميع الأغيار والأنوار والمقامات والأحوال والدنيا والآخرة والنعم الظاهرة والباطنة لا تلاحظ شيئا من ذلك ولا تركن إليه ولا تعتمد عليه بقية أو ذهب فإن ذلك قادح في إخلاص التوحيد. It's an amazing statement. All of the things that happen to you, lights that might come to you, the illumination is what the qawm called barq. You get these flashes of illumination that can happen. Maqamat, all these stations. Ahwal, going into ahwal. وَالدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ, world and other world. وَالنِّعَمَ الظَّاهِرَ وَالْبَاطِنَةِ, and blessings, outwardly and inwardly. لَا تُلَحَّ شَيْئًا مِنْ ذَلِكَ. Don't look at those things like this is what it's about. وَلَا تَرْكَنْ إِلَيْهِ. Don't depend on them, because you can lose your dunya, you can lose your maqam, you can lose all. Don't depend on these things. He said all of these things degrade the sincerity of your tawheed. All of these things degrade the sincerity of your tawheed. Murabat al-Hajj told me once, because I asked him about those, kashf and ahwal and things. He said, لا نلتفت إليها. He said, we don't consider those things. He said, نعبد الله لأنه قال اعبدوا ربكم. He said, we worship Allah because He said worship us. Whatever gifts He might give us in that worship, that's His affair. It's not our affair. We don't worship Him for the gifts. We worship Him just because of the gift of life, and that we're commanded to worship Him. Simple as that. Alhamdulillah. 15 minutes, that was 15 minutes ago? Yeah, okay. Allah yubarak fi. I want to thank, she left I think already, but the Member of Parliament, Layla, Dr. Layla, and her group. Thank you for coming and honoring us, and tashakkur idrim. So, barakallahu fikum, subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa